Professor Mike Taylor is an associate professor of English and co-director of the American Indian Studies program here at BYU. Some of you may not have known that we have an American Indian Studies program, but now you do. His research focuses on Indigenous North American literatures. He is co-author of Returning Home, Diné Creative Works from the Intermountain Indian School. It was published a couple of years ago, and his scholarship has appeared in journals such as Native American and Indigenous Studies, American Quarterly, Modernism and Modernity, Western American Literature. He is currently working on a couple of book projects that are grappling with the interconnected histories and writings of Native nations, U.S. citizenship, and assimilationist education. He went to graduate school at the University of British Columbia, where he was telling me that he really got to see the United States from a more northern perspective, which really shifted some of his interests in the way in which he thought about the history of our country and some of the stories that we can tell in this country, and has been a remarkable advocate for finding stories that not a lot of people have had a chance to hear and understand, and so we're grateful for his research. He is the father of 4 children and has another one on the way in less than 2 months. So we're really grateful that we got you when we did, Mike. Please join me in welcoming Mike Taylor to BYU and to the Kennedy Center in particular.
Thank you, Quinn, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Garrett, for that lovely prayer. I sometimes forget how nice it is to begin a lecture with a prayer and kind of calm yourself down for a second. We are expecting a baby in about 6.5 weeks. If you have any name suggestions, I'll welcome those after. We're struggling with that aspect of this process. But I want to start by thanking a couple of other organizations as well beyond the Kennedy Center. Global Women's Studies, Canadian Studies, the Charles Redd Center for the American West. These are all organizations on campus as well as others off campus that have supported this work. As Quinn suggested, I'm a settler scholar, meaning I'm non-Indigenous and I work within Indigenous Studies. And I'll go off script for a second and share a quick story. I was just talking to Quinn about this, of my interest in the development of this. I went to my PhD program mostly out of curiosity to rethink my understanding of myself in this place we call the United States. And so I was working in the English department, but directly with scholars in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program. And I started my dissertation research up in Juneau, Alaska, in some archives for what was called the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood. And I went to a number of their meetings. They're an organization that's been fighting for Alaska Native rights since 1913. And there was an elderly gentleman who was very skeptical of this white dude showing up in their meetings. And he let me know how skeptical he was. He said, "Why should I listen to you? We've been researched to death and have never received anything for it." And that interaction with him, I'll share the rest of the story for some other time. But that interaction with him shifted my position as a settler scholar, as someone who wants to be a resource to the community rather than turning to community as a resource for me. And so I start today by grabbing the clicker and acknowledging where we are. I know land acknowledgements have become something that are a little more common and sometimes feel a little bit empty because they're not backed up by action. I hope that the work I share today demonstrates my own struggle with trying to hold myself accountable to the relations, to the communities who are represented within my work. So today we're on the ancestral homelands of the Goshute, the Ute, the Paiute, and the Shoshone peoples. Many of you know this already, but Utah is home to 8 distinct tribal nations who are sovereign peoples. And again, I hope that my work and our discussion today not only pays tribute and representation of that reality, but also hopefully together we can demonstrate a way of being and a way of relating with one another that holds ourselves accountable to those relations and those obligations that we have when we claim this place as home. So, as I mentioned, much of my work is collaborative in nature. My main goal ever since that first interaction is to do things that provide something for the community themselves, which means I often end up in archives by myself in basements of libraries and museums and other spaces. And I find things, and I reach out to community and I say, hey, I found this. What would you like to see happen with this? And so today I want to share a couple of examples. One based on the book that Quinn mentioned, and also another one based on a current project that we're working on. But first, I want to give a plug to a good friend of mine, Eugene Tapahi, who this week becomes the first Native American artist to have a full exhibit featured at the MOA here on campus. It's a brilliant, brilliant exhibition. It opens on January 24th, and I hope you'll make time to go. It's just stunningly beautiful, and I hope you'll go. It helps to kind of reposition yourselves again in this space that many of you call home, either permanently or temporarily as students. Today we're talking a lot about boarding schools. I'm going to start with a kind of crash course in the history. I know if we did a raise of hands, some of us know a little bit, some of us have heard a little bit, some of us had never heard at all. I did a poll in my class this semester. We had about 50% or so who had heard of boarding schools. And so we're going to do a quick crash course, and then we'll get into my actual work. Those who do know about boarding schools are probably familiar with this image. It's an image from the Carlisle Indian Industrial Institute, which was the first federally funded boarding school in the United States. You'll see a lot of images today, so I hope that as we're working through it, you're kind of processing the different visual representations that we receive about the various communities' identities. So General Richard Henry Pratt was the founder of the boarding school system. He's the one who argued to Congress that it would be cheaper to assimilate Indians, so-called Indians, than to continue to wage war against them. He has this infamous quote there in bold at the end, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." This became the pedagogical model and philosophy of assimilationist boarding schools. They were meant, and if you go through the documents, they were meant to completely eradicate indigenous culture, language, spirituality, etc., and transform that into what Richard Henry Pratt and his contemporaries saw as more serviceable members of American society. To do that, they presented other images. This one, again, is one of the most famous images from the boarding school. This is Tom Torlino, a Diné young man, or a Navajo young man, who was at the Carlisle Indian Institute. And the government would present these before and after pictures of what the civilization process looks like in these schools as a way to drum up funding and support and so on. This is something, if we bring it to the contemporary moment, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but this is a map of North America, as well as Hawaii, of the federal Indian boarding schools. You can go online. If you look up the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, it's called NABS. They have an interactive map. If you were to zoom up on Utah, you'd see that we had 5 schools here in Utah. And then it also includes Canada's residential school system, which obviously was run differently from a Canadian kind of philosophy, but had the exact same goals. So I'm going to walk us through the basic facts of what's going on right now. Shorely is going to be stalled and limited. We won't comment too much on why that is, but you can guess. We have a new Department of Interior coming in. And for the last few years, the Department of the Interior, under the leadership of Secretary Deb Haaland, has been leading what they call the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. And they've produced so far 2 investigative reports, and I just want to give you a quick summary of what they've determined so far. These reports have been gathered and kind of synthesized from over 103 million government files that they've had a chance to review so far. They're in the process of digitizing those and making them more publicly available. They've been traveling the country to visit different Native communities and to hold listening sessions from survivors and their descendants. And here's what they've found. Again, this is ongoing, so these are all minimal numbers in terms of what actually has and does continue to exist. So at least 417 federally run institutions in 37 different states or then territories. There were at least another 1,000 plus institutions that were assimilationist-minded institutions, but didn't meet the criteria to say they were part of the official federal boarding school system. At least 973 children died in these schools that they've found so far. There are at least 74 marked and unmarked burial sites at least 65 different school sites. And the government, if you were to calculate it in current funds, appropriated over $23 billion to support the assimilationist boarding school program. So, it wasn't until 1978 when Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is currently under attack about every 2 or 3 years again, that parents actually had the choice of whether or not to send their kids to boarding schools. So up till 1978, it was mandatory. Some of the people, even here in this Utah area, were taken by gunpoint to get onto a bus. Some people, their parents weren't informed, just picked up off the street, sent off to school. So not until 1978 did parents have a choice of whether or not their kids had to go to off-reservation boarding schools. So I want to rewind all the way to the beginning. Those of you, I have a few students in here, are reading Sitkala Shaw this semester. And she's got a unique connection to BYU if you want to ask about it in the Q&A. But Sitkala Shaw was taken at the age of 9 to a boarding school in Indiana. She's from South Dakota. And she was among the first generation of students who went through the school. And I apologize, there's going to be a lot of text, but I've condensed as much as I can about her earliest publication of what happened to her on the very first day of entering the boarding school system. So I'm going to read this again, just the condensed version. The first day was a bitter cold one. A large bell rang for breakfast, its loud metallic voice crashing through the belfry overhead and into our sensitive ears. The constant clash of harsh noises with an undercurrent of many voices murmuring an unknown tongue made a bedlam within which I was securely tied. And though my spirit tore itself in struggling for its lost freedom, all was useless. A pale-faced woman with white hair came up after us. We were placed in a line of girls who were marching into the dining room. While we marched in, the boys entered at an opposite door. I watched for the 3 young braves who came in our party. I spied them in the rear ranks looking as uncomfortable as I felt. As I glanced at the long chain of tables, I caught the eyes of a pale-faced woman upon me. Immediately I dropped my eyes, wondering why I was so keenly watched by the strange woman. The man ceased his mutterings, and then a third bell was tapped. Everyone picked up his knife and fork and began eating. I began crying instead, for by this time I was afraid to venture anything more. But this eating by formula was not the hardest trial on that first day. Late in the morning, my friend Judwin gave me a terrible warning. Judwin knew a few words of English, and she had overheard the pale-faced woman talk about cutting our long, heavy hair. We discussed our fate some moments, and when Judwin said we have to submit because they are strong, I rebelled. And again, just a reminder, she's 9, maybe 10 years old at this point. I watched my chance, and when no one noticed, I disappeared. I found a large room with 3 white beds in it. The windows were covered with dark green curtains, which made the room very dim. Thankful that no one was there, I directed my steps toward the corner farthest from the door. On my hands and knees, I crawled under the bed and cuddled myself in the dark corner. I held my breath and watched them open closet doors and peep behind large trunks. I remember being dragged out, though I resisted by kicking and scratching wildly. In spite of myself, I was carried downstairs and tied fast in a chair. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck. and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Since the day I was taken from my mother, I had suffered extreme indignities. People had stared at me. I had been tossed about in the air like a wooden puppet, and now my long hair was shingled like a coward's. In my anguish, I moaned for my mother, but no one came to comfort me. Not a soul reasoned quietly with me, as my mother used to do. For now I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder. So the reason I share this at length is because even though this is the turn of the 19th or 20th century, at the very beginning of the boarding school system, if you know any Native students on campus, their parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles likely experienced something like this, even in the 70s in this Utah space. And it's important to recognize that even though policies shifted over the various iterations of the boarding school system, the fundamental practices seldom shifted of absolute forced integration. So if you go back in your mind to that picture of the Carlisle Indian Institute where everyone's dressed up in basically military uniform, they're all forced to have an anglicized name. Sik Al Shah goes on to describe the abuse that would happen if they were caught speaking their language. And again, this is something that happened for generations. So, let's fast forward. A few years back, in May of 2021, and I promised someone in the audience, Meredith, we're going to get to something hopeful. We will get there. But for now, we got to mourn. News broke of the discovery of 215 unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Canada. The Kamloops report, if those who are following the news back in 2021 remember, there was the first of a string of such reporting of unmarked and otherwise undocumented deaths of Indigenous children throughout Canada and the United States. So about a month later in June is when Secretary Deb Haaland announced that they'd be doing the first ever federal boarding school initiative. The primary purpose, according to Deb Haaland, was just to figure out at least how many children lost their lives in these institutions. To bring it closer to home, in August of that same year, the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah called for a survey of a 150-acre research farm, is what it currently is, where they know that at least 12 of their children were buried while they were attending what was called the Pengwich boarding school. The hope among many communities is that the U.S. will get somewhere close to what Canada has done with their Truth and Reconciliation Commission that launched, or that ran over the course of about the last decade, about a decade and a half, where they've held public hearings, they've made all of their government records, they've declassified their government records, they've held listening sessions publicly and privately to validate survivors and descendants' stories. They've restructured public curriculum where kids have to learn about residential schools, where a number of universities have to take an Indigenous history foundation course as part of their GE structure. We still are a long ways from there. And like I mentioned, likely put on hold. So as important as it is for us to document and tell the truth about the systematic dislocation of Indigenous children from their families and their communities and their homelands, all of which, by the way, is a strategy just to get more Indigenous land and resources, and that, again, can be traced through all the government documents. These spaces of cultural genocide also became unintended hubs of diverse Indigenous relations. So if you go back to that Carlisle school, shipping kids all the way from Hawaii and Alaska to Pennsylvania, they had kids from so many different tribes, and all of a sudden they're in this space where they are forced to learn English, which means they have a common language that they communicate with one another. So despite the separation from families and lands, despite the widespread abuse of every form, despite Euro-Christian indoctrination, despite outright genocide, assimilationist boarding schools unwittingly enabled Indigenous youth and their posterity to create expansive networks of Indigenous relations that have remained resilient and have come together in solidarity. In other words, the hopeful part. Alongside the reports of intergenerational trauma are coinciding stories of Indigenous resistance, of resilient relations among diverse Indigenous youth, and of creative subversion of settler colonial institutions. So I want to demonstrate this narrative shift, one that acknowledges the systemic violence that is ongoing, but that also acknowledges Indigenous creativity and resilience. So we have that first image from the Carlisle Indian Institute, and the second one is done by a student at the Intermountain Indian School here in Brigham City, Utah, by Robert Chi. If we had time, I'd have you tell me about what difference you notice of what community is presenting what image of indigeneity. Chi's painting is also the one you saw featured on the poster. Connects to the first of the two collaborative projects that I'm really excited to share with you today. So again, the goal is, with both of these collaborative projects, is to demonstrate not only how strong Indigenous communities continue to be in their rebuilding and healing processes and their ongoing systems of self-governance, but also to demonstrate how we might actually be able to criticize colonial institutions and other institutions of harm without giving all the emphasis of our work to those institutions. That we can hold up both simultaneously instead of continually we so often critique the colonial institution, and so doing, all we do is say how successful they were, instead of highlighting how successful Indigenous peoples have been in surviving attempted genocide for generations. And so that's what the hope of these two collaborative projects are. So the first one began when I and a then undergraduate research assistant, his name's Terrence Ride, came across the preface to an archived collection of poems written and published by a 17-year-old Navajo student named Henry Tinhorn, who was up in Brigham City at the Intermountain Indian School. So that school is the largest post-World War II federal Indian boarding school. You'll hear later, I have a little video clip at the end that locates the ending of boarding schools in the 60s. That one ran actually to 1984. But he published this full collection of poetry as a 17-year-old kid inside the boarding school system. And the preface reads, "For ages, people had the assumption that the power of the pen could save mankind, but I think the future lies with the young. Nevertheless, my life is bound in here, and the fears, joys, knowledge, and stupidity of myself screams from the seams of this book. The poems in here were not meant to get anyone uptight. All I ask is remember me, not by my actions, but remember me by my poems." So tragically, Tinhorn's preface proved prophetic. Like many boarding school students who were being prepared to join the military, he joined the U.S. military and was deployed to Vietnam, where he died at the age of 20. But what we found was that Tinhorn was one of literally hundreds of young kids writing poetry and creating art in ways that kept them connected to home and to culture and to identity at a time when the entire school system is trying to rid that from their identities. So Tinhorn's poetry, with this prefaced emphasis on the power of poetry as a form of personal and cultural remembering, sent me searching for additional archives and genres of boarding school stories and for opportunities to return such stories to their original families, communities, and homelands, to offer, as Cherokee scholar Jeff Corntassel suggests, a vital source for communal resurgence. As a starting point, I reached out to a good friend, and many of you in here probably know her. Her name's Farina King. She's a Diné historian, or Navajo historian. And I told her about this repository of student creativity that we'd found up at the Utah State's special collections. And I said, hey, do you know how we could get this back to people who care, to their community, to their families, and so on? And it just so happened that she was working on a oral history of the school at the same time with survivors of the school. And so together we reached out to another colleague here at BYU. His name's James Swenson. He's an art historian. And we gathered a group of undergraduate and graduate students, and we began to build relationships with surviving alumni of the school. And we started to curate a collection of Diné Creative Works, Some found in archives, some found on eBay. People used to sell boarding school kids' art as collector's items. And we started to gather. These are a sample of the things that the kids themselves published and edited as students up at Intermountain. On the walls and doors and lockers and so on, we found sketches and block prints and paintings. Even these massive, like 16-foot long murals that students had created. And from these materials, we started to work with surviving alumni and community members to put together a traveling exhibit that could go to different spaces on the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is organized in a bunch of chapters, and so they have what are called chapter houses. It's kind of the local councils for each of the different sections of the reservation. And so we traveled to there, we traveled to different public schools and met with K-12 kids. And then we had a culminating event at the Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, which is the capital of Navajo Nation. And so just a couple images here. And again, this was all thanks to funding from some of the folks that I mentioned at the beginning that we could make this possible. This was just a really lovely event where surviving alumni came as kind of a form of reunion, had a big dinner, and then got up and shared their stories. So that one, again, that one's about 16 feet long. James Swenson, he's not here, but shout out to James. He drove a U-Haul all the way down to Window Rock carrying this giant mural for us. As we were doing building these relations with surviving alumni, they invited us to come camping with them at their annual reunion, where they gather together and they just sit and tell stories. This was another turning point for me in this, in my own understanding of what boarding schools were and the legacy that they continue to hold for different communities. When we got there, I was thinking, oh no, this is going to be a heavy weekend. And instead, I didn't understand almost anything because they spoke the Navajo language the entire time. They hired Navajo Elvis to come and perform. They stayed up late into the night dancing with each other. And it was like this beautiful community that they had built while they were young kids removed hundreds of miles away from home. And they've sustained it over generations. And I'm like, what in the world? This isn't what boarding schools were supposed to create. They were supposed to make this not possible. And so while we were there, we were sharing all the things we'd found. We brought these different like booklets that listed all the poets' names, whose poetry we'd found, things like that. And people would say, hey, wait, that's my auntie, or that's me, or I can't wait to show my kids that I was a poet. And so they asked us to produce a book, which again, thanks to funding, we were able to make free to all the alumni that we come in contact with. And so I want to share, we have a couple of kind of critical introductions to help position the school within its larger history of the boarding school system. But the real power of the book is more of an anthology of the kids' creativity. So again, we have the visual art images, but then we have poetry organized in different thematic sections of homelands, family, school, and what we're calling global awareness. And so I want to read just my favorite poem from each of those sections. This one's another one from Henry Tinhorn called The Mountain's Lament. And we can talk later about the kind of cultural significance of the really cool things he does here poetically. But where are my people? The mountains cry out. I've seen them play and live in my hands, and I've felt them run the trail of my back. Before the sleepy winter came, I heard their laughter ring out and fill the valleys with joy. Now there's only the sounds of silence where once a baby had talked in meaningless sentences. Mr. Sun, you've traveled. Do you know where my people are? A drop of golden sunshine was the answer. Have you seen my people? The mountains asked the sky. But the rains came, and that was the sky's reply. The next one comes from a section that we categorized as family, poems about family, by Teddy Key. My mother is old and gray, though young in years and small. She partook of the hardships of the past that hovered over all. She remembers the fear of the whites and the coyotes' dreary howls across the wild and barren desert where they dread night to fall. I hope you're noticing that these poems are not just important because of their contextual significance, but they are also carrying on a long literary history of the Diné people. They're making really important aesthetic choices and ways of presenting cultural identity. The next one, and this one you can see that how young some of the kids are, right? These are yearbook pictures that are featured within the book. The next one I'll read is that top right one, just called School by Lorraine Cody. A cloud of gray loneliness covers me when my black calendar starts blowing back and forth in the cool autumn breeze as it counts the days. I drag my feet, wishing that days were longer. I wish, oh how I wish, I'd never have to leave my old Hogan again. And then the last one I'll share with you is this one is untitled. It's from our Global Awareness section. And if you don't know the different references, jot them down and look them up. Because it's wild to think that a teenage kid's this connected to the various activist movements of the early 1970s. So, I am Black Mesa, exploit me, bleed me, forget me to let me die. I am Alcatraz, trying to regain myself. You fear me and leave me homeless. I am Wounded Knee. All that is left of me is a dance of spirit ways. You fear it more than 1,000 armies. In the snowy silence I rest. I am Freedom, wounded and struggling, hounded, then forgotten. Leave me. I am Freedom. I care what happens to me. So I remember talking to the creative rights, that'd be a fun class. The creative writing teacher. She was a young Utah State graduate who had been hired at Intermountain to start teaching in the language arts program. And she proposed that they start a creative writing class that would help kids process not being at home and so on. And the administrators said, this was their direct quote, Indian kids can't write sonnets, meaning they don't know how to write poetry. She was able to push it through and get a little creative writing section that then kind of blossomed into quite a large section of what the school was able to do, or what the students were able to do in the school, frame it that way. And she told me the only things, because again, this is 1970s, right? This is different than Sitkala Shah's version. The only thing they weren't allowed to write, the administrators would not let them write about sex or drugs. But she was able to let the kids write about almost everything else. And this is what the kids produced. And I hope you're recognizing again, we have to focus and we have to remember and we have to continue to tell about the violence. We can't overwrite that and act like it wasn't as significant as it was. But if we focus only on that, we forget this whole other subset of stories that demonstrate diverse cultures' ability to keep going. So, yeah, I've got time for the video still. While doing this work on the original book and these kind of collaborative relations that were developed, we recognized that we should have already, I'm sure my collaborators already knew, but I recognized that rather than waiting for the federal government to come up with some apology, which Biden did a couple weeks ago for the first time ever, rather than waiting for the federal government to develop some type of program of reconciliation, communities themselves have been reconciling and healing and rebuilding and reconnecting since Sitkala Shah's time. Right? Since the very first generation of boarding school survivors, they've been figuring out how to regroup in really beautiful, powerful ways. And so I'm currently co-editing a collection with a Mohawk scholar based up at Concordia University in Canada. Her name's Llewellyn White. And what we're trying to do is offer a venue within the academic space where those stories who often don't get academic credence are given voice. Llewellyn herself has a story she's been holding on to forever about direct spiritual experiences she's had that have led her to do the work that she's doing. And she's never wanted to put that out in academia because she hates the idea of editors telling her that she's writing it the wrong way or doing different things. This collection that we're co-editing is trying to create a space where Indigenous community scholars and just everyday community members have a chance to share authentic stories in a way that's less filtered from academia than stories often are. To give you a quick kind of anecdotal context of Llewellyn, the investigative reports documented children deaths at the schools. One of the things that the schools did is summer outing programs where kids would be placed as sometimes servants, sometimes agricultural workers, etc., into white families in the area. Some kids died while they were on outings and are buried in public cemeteries all over the country. So right now Llewellyn's working in going back and forth between Canada and Philadelphia and identifying all of the boarding school kids who died while they were in outings in the public cemeteries of Philadelphia and getting that information back to the tribal communities, to the nations, to the families. And she's had a number of really powerful, in this space, hopefully you respect and acknowledge the validity of spiritual experiences that have led her to do the work that she needs to do and to find the kids that she needs to find. So I want to end by sharing just one quick example. This is from Lauren Peters, who took on the responsibility from her community in Alaska to rematriate the remains of one of her ancestors from the Carlisle Indian Institute back to her home community. So we're going to just watch this for a couple minutes and then we'll close and open up for questions.
A mother and her 2 sons traveled to Carlisle, Pennsylvania to rematriate the remains of their ancestor, Sophia Titoff, and bring her back home to St. Paul Island on the Bering Sea. Lauren Peters, Sophia's great-great-niece and a Native American Studies doctoral student at UC Davis, has documented her journey in bringing Sophia home, as well as other Alaska Native children buried in boarding school cemeteries across the United States. Sophia was one of at least 100,000 orphans taken from their native homes and placed into U.S. government-sponsored indigenous boarding schools across North America. These orphans were stripped of their culture and often became servants to local townspeople and homes, businesses, and farms from the late 1800s to the 1960s. In 1896, Sophia was orphaned, taken from her home, and eventually arrived at the Carlisle School. 5 years after her arrival, she became ill with tuberculosis, died, and was buried at the school with an incorrect gravestone. Lauren, with the help of her 2 sons, Lucas and UC Davis student Andrew, has brought Sophia to St. Paul Island to be laid to rest in her home. Lauren hopes her scholarly work will help other Native families work through this process of rematriating their lost relatives.
Whoops. Okay. So Lauren's is just one of a number of pieces that are being written and shared within this collection. Hopefully we've recognized this struggle to balance the recognition that you have to work through the pain. But if we focus only on the pain, we're missing an entire world of stories. We have another woman, her name's Yufna Soldier Wolf of the Northern Arapahoes, who also rematriated the remains of kids from her tribal community up in Wyoming. And the pain of it was, there's a whole list of reasons why it was hard. The military currently owns Carlisle. It was just designated as a national monument, so hopefully it won't get torn down. The last remaining building won't get torn down, like has been threatened for years. But to get military access, to be given time frames, you have to be in and out by this certain time, to be stopped in the airport because you're carrying human remains and trying to fly home with them. These are all part of that really painful process of healing. But then you have these moments where you're back home in your community doing that heroic work of healing. And our hope with this collection, Llewellyn and I, is that we demonstrate that Indigenous communities are taking their own diverse approaches to reconciling these experiences. And yes, we hope the federal government does something, and we hope it doesn't all get stopped, what was already started a few years ago. But all along the way, communities have been doing this work. And as scholars and students in this space, we have access to a lot of resources that can aid in these initiatives. And so I hope that as we have a quick discussion, we're running out of time, that you're all getting ideas of like, how can I use the access I have to resources to actually support, not to go and correct and to fix and solve the problems, but to actually offer yourself as a resource to communities whose theft of lands and lives and everything else you've benefited from. So I'll stop it there and we'll turn it over for Q&A. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, Mike, for a thoughtful presentation. I do want to also thank our program in American Indian Studies and our program in American Studies, which have co-sponsored this lecture today. We have about 15 minutes for questions and dialogue from the audience. We invite you to raise your hand. We have 2 students in the back who will bring you a microphone. Please stand and introduce yourself briefly and ask your question. We'll go till 1 p.m. Thanks.
James Jeffries, can you speak to the LDS Indian Placement Program and the relationship between First Nations and the LDS Church?
Sure. Yeah, good question. This is a question that comes up a lot in this space at BYU. And I don't want to come off as an apologist, but I do want to share the differing contexts for a second. Federal Indian boarding schools were mandatory, as I mentioned, until 1978. Treaty obligations could be withheld from families and from communities if their kids didn't go to school. The Indian placement program for the church was voluntary. There were obviously cultural pressures, like many of you have felt, to go on missions. But they were voluntary. The range of experiences are also everything from abuse of every form in placement families' homes and really lovely intergenerational relations that have been healthy and maintained for many years. The cultural biases that exist and were spoken over pulpits at local and general levels are hard because they seem to buy into a racial hierarchy and an assumption that white middle class is the ideal life. At the same time, education for most Native kids, the only other option was boarding schools. And so a lot of Native families in this Mountain West area chose placement because it allowed their kids to go to a school that was a public school and is the same curriculum as other public school kids, whereas boarding schools were still the assimilationist agenda type of schooling. So my kind of general response is well-intentioned, but also couched within a lot of problematic assumptions about race and about communities' ability to take care of themselves and all the things that we often do when we, as institutions, put on a social uplift program rather than collaborating directly to develop one with the community themselves. So we could talk a long time about that one, but I guess my general response is the problem and the possibility of that program, as well as the negative and positive experiences, is the entire spectrum. So.
Did you opt out of boarding school? The government would let you opt out.
Yeah, the other option at the time during placement were also what are called day schools, where you would go off reservation for the week and come home for the weekends. You'd stay in dormitories. And so a number of Native families chose that it might be better to actually stay in a family setting rather than in a dormitory of teenagers that are also being often persecuted by border town politics and attitudes among their peers. So it gave them kind of a family structure from which they could go to the public school system. Again, this is not my intention is not to somehow say it was a fantastic program, but rather these were the kind of justifications used and the differentiation between the boarding school system and the church's voluntary placement program. Hi, Edie.
Hi. Okay, I'm Aiden or Adi. I'm studying American Studies and English, and you've talked a lot about the kind of emotional baggage that comes with these things and like the pain and the healing. And one of the emotions I'm really interested in is anger and understanding how both these indigenous populations and white populations deal with the anger that comes from understanding these experiences, and how do we use that to like promote healing and peacemaking and these understandings, rather than, I don't know, just how do we use anger in like a Christ-like way?
We cleanse the temple, right? That's how Christ used anger. No, in a more serious response, it's really hard because when indigenous peoples get in these kind of official spaces, like working with the military to get access, you can't be angry because it's stereotypical. You can't be an angry Indian. And so they have to somehow channel that emotion into thoughtful dialogue with people who they know or can often safely assume don't have their best interest. The other side of your question, though, like how do you process anger, right? I don't think anger is ever a healthy thing to stay in long term. And so we see this a lot in our American Indian Studies students. I know you'll be meeting a lot of them throughout the semester in your course you're taking. When you process anger collectively and you make decisions of how to act, it leads to change that can be productive. It leads to change that can have some momentum, and it leads to a sharing of that anger across in ways that lessens the like emotional intensity of your individual anger. At least that's something that I've seen across our AIS students, is there are a lot of things to be angry about in our current moment too. There are a lot of ongoing attacks on indigeneity and on their sovereignty and everything else. But if you're angry all the time, there are moments where you have to march. There are also moments where you have to sit down and organize and educate. And you and I have access to education, and that often does a lot more immediate good on our audiences that we have access to than just getting mad and letting that anger just spew out in whatever emotional language comes with it. So, something I'm still working through, Adi.
Hi, my name is Reese Curtis. Oh, sorry. Are you going? Okay. I'm a marketing global women's studies student. You mentioned how we want to be a resource to these communities rather than using them as a resource in almost a white savior kind of context. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, how do you think the most efficient way for someone like me who's a student is to use the resources that you mentioned are available to just show that respect and support for these communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously today we're talking about indigenous communities, but I think it goes for any community beyond yourself or even your own community that needs you as a resource. I've learned there are two approaches, and I think the latter one I'm going to share is more effective. The first one is just showing up and saying, hey, I'd love to help. And then leaving when you're uninvited and not forcing your help on a community. The second one is to continually reach out with an invitation of, I would love to be involved however I can be. If you see me as being any service to your initiative, know that I would love to help. And waiting for invitation. But once that invitation comes, to actually be willing to do whatever you're invited to do. The reason I get to do this this edition with Llewellyn White is frankly because I said, Llewellyn, I will do any of the busy work to make this happen. I'll write all the emails. I'll do all the stuff with the press that's frustrating and annoying sometimes. I'll do whatever you don't want to do that will enable this collection to happen. So being willing to do the mundane, busy work, the behind-the-scenes work. I'll give just a quick localized example. A few years ago, some of you know this, but the peak back here was renamed to Kive Peak. The news reached out to me because a number of my students were researching as part of the original Repeat Committee for Provo City and asked me for a feature. And I said, you should talk to the students and to the native folks that are leading the charge. Instead, another guy who looks like me was the front image, because news often will go to whoever is like easiest to access. So whatever you can do to channel the attention away from yourself to the communities who are doing the work, except for in those vulnerable positions where you have a little more social and cultural capital and protection to be vulnerable. Then you allow yourself to be invited into that position. Hopefully, again, all these, we can have such long conversations. But thanks for that question.
I'm Kayleen Talbot, doing American Studies, and I'm curious why you think these children in the boarding schools turn towards art and poetry and things like that as an outlet to cultivate their identities, and if there are any other outlets that they found for that purpose.
Yeah, great question. Part of it depended on what was allowed, like what they had access to within the schools. Some schools from the very beginning had music programs. Zikala Shah herself was a violinist that was trained originally in boarding schools and then eventually went on to college and studied violin, wrote the first ever Native American opera with a BYU music professor here. Schools in Alaska, I know one had students who were able to do opera, like opera singers. They had marching bands, they had sports. Intermountain had an annual rodeo. So I think there are a lot of ways that kids said, these are spaces where I can still exercise a little bit of autonomy. The arts are an autonomous space. If you look early on in the boarding school system, the school administrators use these artistic kind of outputs as proof that the civilization project was working. And so you read some of the earliest school publications, and it's very filtered, like, yeah, I love school, like a poem about how great Carlisle is. And that's not to say that no one was making the most out of their time in those spaces. But it was very filtered to a specific narrative. The ones I shared today got into like civil rights activism, the American Indian movement. That was a very different moment of Intermountain actually getting like lawsuits against the school for civil rights, for breaking civil rights for their kids and things like that. So they had a different freedom and flexibility, but we've seen it across. There are student newspapers, there are all sorts of different outlets where if you read closely, you're like, wow, look how creatively they were subverting what they weren't allowed to do in order to still put forward a cultural identity that is intact rather than dislocated and completely assimilated. George, I think you have the last question.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm George. I'm an English major. My question for, I guess, activism and for help is, where do you work? I guess I'm basing mine based on my experience in Dennehotso, where this is a place where there's no infrastructure, really. The chapter house can't sustain public works. There's no public spaces. And the Dennehotso boarding school is a third-rate education, and most everyone just goes to the Army from there because they have no options to integrate. So if you're trying to do literary work, how can you, I guess, present that in a space for the people to appreciate? If the education is so poor, how could the people within the structure appreciate it? And why focus on these matters when 85% of the residents don't have running water or electricity?
Mm-hmm.
A lot
Big
of questions.
questions, George. Let's see which ones we take on. Let's start with the last one. You're a student of English. You know the power of narrative. It's easy to allow ourselves to say what we do is not quite as important as running water, electricity, etc. But the narratives we create and perpetuate are the things that make those possible, right? If we continue to perpetuate certain narratives that justify violence because they led to learning English, for example. You hear this all the time with boarding schools. Well, didn't they get to learn English? Wasn't it like a way to integrate into the community? You're like, yeah, you can learn English without being abused. Like that's something we've all done before. So if you can create a narrative and help communities themselves recognize a different narrative than the one that the larger kind of national curricular narrative is presenting, that has the potential to lead to structural change, economic change, legal change. If you study current Supreme Court issues that have to do with Indigenous rights, you'll see that the prosecutor or defense, whatever one's on the government side or against the tribe, are still using the same stereotypical narratives. When they argue against the Indian Child Welfare Act, they still argue that Native people can't take care of their own kids. When they argue against tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction in Oklahoma, they still argue that tribes are unhealthy because it's their own fault, rather than recognizing that tribes are running their own hospitals and allowing non-tribal members into their space because the state hospitals don't have room. Right? So they're still arguing the same stereotypical narratives that give a certain part of our community power to make larger structural decisions. Rewind to your other question, and I know we have to cut this. We found that the literacy if you bring literacy that's from their own community into the space, the experience with that literature changes. When a kid reads a Navajo poet by his great-grandpa, or a poem by his great-grandpa, rather than, I don't know, some American author, Thoreau, Emerson, as wonderful as they are, there's a completely different dynamic that happens with the reception of that literature and with the recognition of the value of that literature. And again, there are lots of stories of what happens when we start to read these different boarding school stories in community spaces, and how they're received differently and what type of relational changes start to happen in that space. It's hard to kind of give a thesis argument about why literature matters to a community that doesn't have running water until they finally get presented with literature produced by their own community. And then all of a sudden it makes a lot of difference. Okay, thank you all. I think we're out of time.